Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Monday, March 24th. We just got past the first day of spring, after which we had a nice snowfall here in Western New York, as is usual. And of course, we always get one in April, right when you've been doing things outside, maybe wearing your shorts a few days, but then you get the snowfall. And I don't mean like a few flakes that melt when they hit the ground. You'll get the ground covered with at least a few inches of snow, and then you just want to drive your car off the Peace Bridge when that happens. But right now we've got some nice weather and some cold weather coming our way. But I know you didn't tune in for a Western New York weather report. And what I want to talk about today is a little bit about political philosophy. While that might not seem topical at the moment, I think it is. It's actually long overdue, in my opinion, and something that I've wanted to talk about for a while. And I think it's a good time now that we've had kind of a shift in American politics and somewhat of what people perceive as a swing toward the right. I think that's probably accurate. But I wanted to address this idea of the political spectrum, which I don't think exists. I do not think that politics can all be explained and political movements can all be explained along some binary spectrum where at the far right is very conservative and at the far left would be very liberal and I guess socialist or communist, and that everybody else falls somewhere in the middle. And particularly libertarianism, which is considered, well, I don't know if it's considered this, but you have to count it as kind of a fringe movement in 21st century America if you judge that by what people vote for the Libertarian Party. Now, there are some Republican politicians who might describe themselves as libertarian. I don't know of too many Democratic politicians these days that would do that. I do remember some from earlier decades that were Democrats who might also use that word to describe themselves. But I think people have this idea that if you're a libertarian, you also fall on this spectrum, and you could be a right libertarian or a conservative leaning libertarian or a liberal left leaning libertarian. And I think that's totally wrong. And I think that when I'm done here today, for all of you who haven't read my 2015 book, I'm going to try to get the essence of that down in just a few minutes here. And I think you'll be convinced that that's a completely wrong way to look at the political landscape. So bold words that require extraordinary proof, I guess one might say. And let me say first by defining a few terms. When I say conservative, liberal, libertarian, I think everybody knows libertarian is purely a political philosophy, okay? But conservative, some people might tend to think, well, look, I'm not libertine. I don't believe in, I don't know, sex before marriage or abusing alcohol or drugs or anything that you would think of as kind of a libertine lifestyle. And that makes me a conservative. And socially, that's fine. But in a political context, it doesn't matter whether you're a libertine or whether you're a very reserved person, believes in monogamy and all those things. That doesn't make you a political conservative. So when I say conservative on this podcast, I strictly mean the political philosophy. And it does have tenets, and it is completely different from libertarianism. I'm going to argue that actually the 19th century, that the two main competing political philosophies were not conservative and liberal. They were conservative in what we would now call libertarian. and that what we now call liberal, it was back there, of course, but it never had any political power, and for most of the 19th century. And liberal as well. You could be somebody who, is a bleeding heart personally. And every time you see a homeless person, you give them a few bucks or buy them a sandwich. And you do all kinds of volunteer causes and whatever. And you're a libertine, or you are a libertine, either one. And you party hard and you don't go for any of this traditional morality. That doesn't make you a political liberal. Being a political liberal, there is an actual philosophy there. And when I say liberal, we should just say socialist, because that's what they are in modern America. They're socialists. They're not all abolish private property, completely communists, but they're all socialists the way socialism would have been perceived before Marx, where there's a wide spectrum where they didn't all believe that private property should be abolished. Okay, so what does tie liberalism together? I think I'm going to start with liberalism because it's easier to distinguish from the other two. And people don't get too confused with any overlap between what we now call today a liberal and what we call a conservative or a libertarian. Okay, so to me, first of all, if you want to understand all this, you read my book, and then you don't have to read like 6 other books because I condensed it all into one book. And now you're going to get it in one podcast. I'm just here for you. And I'll post a free excerpt of the book that I'm talking about. It's called Where Do Conservatives and Liberals Come From? Where if you just read the free excerpt, you kind of get it. And if you want to go on and purchase a paperback, hey, we appreciate the support here so I can keep on doing things like this. But in any case, I think if you want to understand modern liberal, as we define it, or socialist thinking in the West, you read Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And you really don't have to read everything by him. Skip his very long, boring book called Emile and read his discourses on inequality and read The Social Contract, which is probably the most famous political thing that he did. Rousseau is a very smart guy, also, in my opinion, completely wrong. Like a lot of smart people are completely wrong when it comes to politics. He wasn't a very nice guy. Maybe we'll get into that. It's not completely essential that you know that, but it's kind of funny that Rousseau was terrible to his children, and so was Marx. And yet, of course, Rousseau wanted to lecture us on how to raise children, among other things. But in any case, the essence of what Rousseau wrote, and if you read his work, you will hear it coming out of the mouths of every American Democrat daily, more than Marx. Marx is kind of a subset extreme version, but they don't really talk as much overtly about Marx anymore, especially since his theories have all been so discredited. But boy, do they sound like Rousseau. And before we get into the 3 philosophies, the way I'm going to talk about them is this. If you want to understand the difference in the way these 3 different groups of people think, then think of it this way. The first thing you should think of is, how do they see what the Enlightenment philosophers call the state of nature? And that doesn't mean like we're wearing loincloths and it's 70,000 BC. What that means is the state we would be in, and perhaps we're in, without any government. Okay? It's not a historical argument. It's a theoretical argument. We could be in a state of nature right now. What's the book that I never read? The Lord of the Flies, where all these kids get dropped off on an island or shipwrecked, whatever. I don't know. I didn't read the book. I read the Iliad instead. The Lord of the Flies was on my summer reading list. Freshman year, going into high school, I get this letter. You got to read 5 books before you start high school. I'm like, what? This is insane. I'm getting homework before I even start. And of course, there were 6 books and you had to choose 5. And I skipped Lord of the Flies and read the Iliad, Glutton for Punishment. Glad I did, though. It's a good book. Anyway, what would life be like in the state of nature? And this is kind of asking, what is the nature of man? Before there is any artificial forces on him, what is he? Okay. What is his nature? And Rousseau writes, if you read, I can't remember which of the two long essays books it was, either in Discourses on Inequality or the Social Contract. I believe it's the Social Contract, that man pre-society is almost like an Adam and Eve kind of character. He's in a state of ignorant innocence. Okay. He's not capable of knowing right from wrong. And he exists in this state. And it's funny because he says in one of the passages that he would barely even know his own children because he's just in this natural state. And so that's what man is before. So what happens that to man in this natural state that disturbs it or necessitates that governments are formed? Okay. And what Rousseau says, and I think this explains all liberal thinking, is that the chief problem with this state of nature is the acquisition of private property. He says the minute that some man fenced in a plot of land and called it mine and convinced, I can't remember what he doesn't say chumps, but he implies that in whatever 18th century language he uses, other fools to believe him, something to that effect. That's the beginning of the problem. So there's this problem that people start acquiring private property, and this leads to inequality that did not exist before. And so it is the government's job, the chief end, the chief purpose of the government is to come in and restore as much of the equality that private property has disrupted. And doesn't that explain the whole, even those that are not Marxists that call themselves liberals, this is their chief goal. What do they talk about all the time? Income inequality. Well, who said that's bad? Why is that a bad thing? Like if I work 16 hours tomorrow and some other guy works 15 hours, then I'm going to make more money, whatever we're making an hour. Let's say we're making the same amount an hour. Okay. I'm going to have more money. We're going to be unequal after that one day of work. Okay. And there's all sorts of other factors that will lead to inequality. And I'm not paraphrasing Rousseau right now. I'm just editorializing. Of course, inequality is a reality of life, but this is the chief end of government. And Rousseau's answer to what kind of government would be best to suit this purpose of restoring equality that's lost when private property is acquired is a democracy. And he means as close to a pure democracy as you can get. Now, he does say that in practical terms, all democracies become republics because it's just not practical for any group of people for every single person to participate in like legislation and those kinds of things. But he says some other things that are very important. Number one, that this democracy is absolute. The will of the majority is absolute. And that when man enters society, he uses the word alienates all his rights to the general will. So you probably heard that. Sometimes people say the will of the people, but the words general will are generally what Rousseau wrote is translated, and that's associated with him. And so there is no restraint on the will of the majority for Rousseau. In fact, he goes so far as to say, and this is definitely in the Social Contract, that the way that he knows that he's in error is when he disagrees with the majority. So The fact that he uses the word alienates is great because we can then say for sure that this is not the philosophy that inspired our founders, who said that these natural rights were inalienable. And he says, well, no, you alienate all your natural rights to the general will. So that is the base thinking of the liberal, socialist, communist movements, is that private property is at best a problem. It's at best something that has to be regulated, watched, because it results in inequality, which must be controlled, must be countered. And Rousseau, he doesn't say that it's achievable to achieve complete equality, but that's the trend. We're supposed to go, and I want to say that in one of the two treatises, he does admit that even in the state of nature, there's some inequality and that there could never be complete equality, but that private property definitely exacerbates this. And he says he's not a abolish private property guy. He says that we're going to achieve the just society not by confiscation, but by regulation to make sure no one gets too wealthy. So that's the basis for all liberal thinking. And if you read his books or read the quotes of his out of my book, the direct quotes, it's almost like the Democrats are carrying around their Rousseau. Their statements are so close to his. Now, Marx, now there were some French socialists that did want to abolish private property. Proudhon is famous for saying property is theft. And then Marx comes along and he says that the French socialists don't go far enough. Okay, they're on the right track, but we do need the abolition of all private property. And I think people pretty much familiar with the basic tenets of Marxism, where he's looking for this proletariat revolution. He had a whole economic treatise called Das Kapital, or just Capital in English, that was complete gibberish in my opinion. I had to read it in college. Of course, I didn't have to read Karl Menger or anybody good in college, just Marx. One of the first reasons that I never sent my own child to school. But I think he's just given way too much credit, even by people who are supposedly free market people. Well, he made some good points about capital. No, he made no good points about capitalism. Zero. At one point, he says that with the introduction of machines, the worker's labor goes to zero in value. Now, I don't even want to get into that, but let's not. So, but Marx is basically on the foundation of Rousseau. He just thinks that a lot more action is needed, more extreme action. I hate using that word, but to go to the extreme of abolishing private property, of a proletariat revolution to take over the means of production, which they did in Russia, was a disaster. So that's the liberals, what we call liberals. We should call them socialists. And by the way, 100 years ago, if you thought like a libertarian today, you would have been called a liberal. In the 19th century, the British party that wanted free markets, free trade, limited government was called the Liberal Party. Now, some socialism crept into the Liberal Party later. And really, the hardcore people were the Whigs early in the 19th century. And in the 18th century, they would have been called the Whigs. And then later the Liberal Party. So I think if you look at, here's where I think people are confused sometimes by what people who call themselves today liberals do. And from now on, when I say liberal, I'll just mean the people who say they're liberals today, so we don't get confused. When they want to censor speech or they want to get around due process, everybody wants to do that, including Trump, right? Did that previous podcast about that. So, and then you go to them and you say, oh, I thought that liberals were for free speech. Bill Maher says things like this all the time. I thought liberals were for freedom of association. Well, no, that's not their end goal. Their end goal is economic equality. So to the extent free speech and all those things serve that end, then they're for it. But as Marcuse said in Repressive Tolerance 50 years ago, it's not serving that end anymore. And so now we should be against it. So, and we're going to get to where the conservatives, it's the same thing when people get all confused. Well, I thought conservatives believe this or that. Well, you have to always look, what is the goal? What do they think that the government is supposed to achieve in the end? And for liberals, it's economic equality. And anything that doesn't serve that end or runs contrary to that end, they're willing to set aside. So hopefully that will explain their positions more. And if you want to argue with these people, then you should know how they think. And I think the last thing I'll say about the liberal mindset is that it's very childish. And one of the concepts they just cannot abide, they will just not accept. And even I talk to people who aren't necessarily thinking about politics all the time, the invisible hand. So hopefully I have a song about the invisible hand that I think it's the only free market rock anthem ever recorded. And we did a video with the great Brian Seaman who produced it. He shot it and produced it. He's an OG Ron Paul Revolution guy. But basically the invisible hand concept is that people pursuing their self-interest within a framework where property rights are defended do far more good for society than anybody trying to set aside their self-interest for the good of society. Adam Smith had this great insight even before he wrote Wealth of Nations in his first book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, where I think he says it a little better, actually. They can't accept this. The proof is everywhere. Since Adam Smith said it, like the invisible hand has a shutout going for the do-gooders. Okay, you can't find any of the do-gooders who have actually made a lasting improvement on the human condition. Mother Teresa, I think she's like a conservative one, or at least religious, whomever. You can help an individual person, but everything about our lives that is better was created by someone pursuing their self-interest. And they just can't accept this. They live in this childlike state where people are going to be out there sacrificing their own interests for the good of society or somebody else or whatever. All the movies they make, that's what the hero does, to be the hero. I remember seeing the movie, what was it called? It was in the early 2000s, and it was with the model who plays the devil, and I can't even remember who the main character is. Anyway, it's like the person is saved at the end because of this self-sacrifice that they decide to make for the good of humanity. Okay, they just can't get out of that. And when you think about it, that's not scalable. Okay, if everybody gave up their self-interest, nobody's interest would be served. That's like one of those harsh realities about the world we live in. And there is no immutable law of nature that says that just giving up your self-interest is good. Okay? I would argue that the good comes from respecting the property rights of others, but we'll get to that. But in any case, the invisible hand was a chief insight that was part of the American Revolution. These people revered Adam Smith and Baptiste Say, however you say that name, Say, where the French speakers will tell me. And I understand Adam Smith made mistakes. The labor theory of value was a mistake. And Karl Menger later corrected that mistake. And Marx took the labor theory of value and he ran out of the stadium with it. And that showed how bad it was, how wrong it was. Okay, but that doesn't mean they didn't have great insights into economics. And most of what Smith did was very good. Okay, so I think that's enough on the liberals. Let me get to the conservatives. So to me, if you really want to understand conservative thinking, you have to read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. And a whole bunch of people who identify as conservatives' heads just explode. What? The all powerful centralized government? No, that's the opposite of conservatism. No, it's not. And let me tell you why. Go with me on this. And for all the people who are yelling Edmund Burke's name, we're going to get to him. So Hobbes did put forth a treatise that argued for an all-powerful centralized authority. It didn't necessarily have to be a king. So go back and reread it if you read it and that's what you thought. Throughout his treatise, he says a monarch or an assembly, either one. His main issue was that the power had to be unified, the separation of powers thing. He wanted no part of that. But I'm ahead of myself because I'm talking about the form of government he wanted. What makes him the father of conservatism is what he thought about the state of nature and the reason for having a government. So unlike Rousseau, who thought that man was this ignorant, almost angel in the state of nature until he started acquiring property, Hobbes thought man was a complete unredeemable savage in the state of nature. You've probably heard some of the things that he said in sound bites, like the state of nature is a state of war, that it's a war of everyone against everyone, that life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's the whole quote. It's a lot of people just say nasty, brutish, and short. It's solitary, poor. That's important, that part. So solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And what he says is that the natural state is the state of war, of conflict, that not only will man attack his fellow man at any opportunity to take his goods, to take his spouse, wife, his land, whatever, but that he will never keep a contract in the state of nature because there's no one there to enforce it. He paints this very bleak picture. And this is really the way conservatives see the world. So what is the purpose of the government for Hobbes? It is to thwart, to repress the savage nature in man and allow a peaceful society to emerge. And the only way that Hobbes could envision this to happen is this all-powerful government. He uses the words to keep him in awe throughout the treatise to say this is what the government's got to do. It's got to be powerful enough that these men don't rebel against it and that they keep its laws. And it's the first and primary purpose of all the laws is peace. So it's good. It's a good goal to have because the state of nature is a state of war. So you see the liberals, once you start acquiring property, you got this state of inequality. Purpose of the government is to restore equality. For the conservatives, for Hobbes, the state of nature is a state of war. And you need the government to impose peace. And the only way to do it is with an all-powerful monarch or an all-powerful assembly. So you got to remember that when Hobbes is writing this, he's writing it right near the end of the Commonwealth, where the English had their civil war and they had beheaded the king, and they had Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. I'm not sure if he was dead by the time Hobbes wrote his treatise or not, but they had this republic, if you want to call it that, where they had the parliament ruling, and the parliament was elected. It wasn't by a vote of all the people, which is not required for a republic, by the way. He's writing in a time that he had lived through was not good. It's not good to be in a civil war, believe me. In a real shooting, well, yes, it was a shooting war in the 1600s, a lot of sword play too, but you don't want to be in a hot civil war. Very bad. Okay. And this may have affected him to inspired him to say, look, we need this all powerful government that just keeps everybody in line. And he did believe that people should be allowed some liberty. What liberty? As much as will not cause disorder. Property, as much as would serve the end of peace and order. Okay. So these things are not inalienable rights to Hobbes. In fact, on the subject of rights in the state of nature, he says that people have natural rights, but the problem is they have a right to everything, even to one another's bodies. So, in other words, what he thinks of as rights are not moral principles the way we think of them today, but really, and I think most conservatives don't think of them either. And I'll give you some examples of that. But he just thinks like whatever is practically you have in the state of nature, that's what your rights are. So, in other words, if they can be violated, they're not rights. Okay. And only the government can create rights because they can thwart this state of war, impose a state of peace, and from that, rights emerge by ultimately authority of the government. Whatever the government allows you to do, you have a right to do. And so, okay, that's Hobbes. And you're still going to say, first of all, I want you to think about the way conservatives talk all the time. Do people in Iran have the right to free speech? Well, yes, of course they do. It's just that the Iranian government does not respect it. Okay. So I would say, do people, a better example, because Iran's nowhere near as bad as the warmongers make it out to be. It's bad. I wouldn't want to live there. But anyway, let's say North Korea. Okay. Do people in North Korea have the right to free speech? Yes, they do. It's just that the government violates it all the time. Well, for a conservative, the right doesn't exist then. That's what Hobbes would say. And deep down, that's how conservatives think. So you say, well, come on, Tom. They don't. So I'm a conservative, and every conservative here is saying, I don't believe in an all-powerful government. That seems the opposite. And for those of you who are more into the philosophical reading some of the pillars, I'm more of a Burkean conservative. I believe in local government. Okay, that's right. And Burke certainly was a huge influence on the conservative movement. He's not nearly as federalist, I think, as a lot of people would like to think he is. He was a big empire guy, but he was a very practical person. And he criticized the government, the king or the parliament or both, the empire basically, for overturning like the system in India without replacing it with anything. So he was like, look, at what they had was bad. You didn't replace it with something. So at least what they had worked to a certain extent. And he said similar things about the American colonies, not that they had overturned what was here, but in other words, they've got these long-standing traditions, and we're better off, like to the extent we can, just allowing them to continue. So this idea of prescription comes up, which is that our rights come from long traditions that establish them through trial and error, right? And those traditions don't necessarily have to be government. They could be church, or they could be long-standing social institutions. But here's the kicker. For Burke, the purpose of the government is the same as for Hobbes, which is he sees man the same way, as this savage. And he says this explicitly in his reflections on the revolution in France. Now, he wasn't a treatise guy, but he did write this long piece. And I'm going to read you what he writes. Now, remember, Hobbes said the problem with the state of nature is that people have a right to everything. including each other's bodies. So in other words, you could do whatever you want. Your right is whatever you want to do unless somebody bigger knocks you over the head with a club or whatever, right? So here, this is from Burke's Reflections on the Revolutions in France, because he talks about natural rights there. He said, government is not made in virtue of natural rights, which may and do exist in total independence of it. Okay, so he says, here's another thing. Governments, according to Thomas Jefferson, governments are instituted to secure our rights. But Burke does not agree. Okay, not made in virtue of natural rights, which may and do exist in total independence of it. So in other words, natural rights do exist in the state of nature. Okay, but what are they? He says, and exist in much greater clearness and in a much greater degree of abstract perfection, but their abstract perfection is their practical defect. By having a right to everything, they want everything. Okay, so he's just repeating Thomas Hobbes here. He's in lockstep with him. The problem with the state of nature is that people have a right to everything, or they want everything. There's no security for the individual. But I'll go on. By having a right to everything, they want everything. Government is a contrivance of human wisdom to provide for human wants. Men have a right that these wants should be provided for by this wisdom. Among these wants is to be reckoned the want out of civil society of a sufficient restraint upon their passions. Society requires not only that the passions of individuals should be subjected, but that even in the mass and body, as well as in the individuals, the inclinations of men should frequently be thwarted, their will controlled, and their passions brought into subjection. So Hobbes and Burke have the same idea about the nature of man, the same idea about the purpose of government. It's not to secure any inalienable rights, because we don't have those. It is to thwart our savage nature, our natural passions, however you want to describe it, and create order out of which society can function. They just differ on what the government should look like, what its form should be. Hobbes says only the raw power of a centralized government with no checks, no balances, no separation of powers, because that just leads to the Civil War we all just went through, right? Burke, no, we've got all these long-standing traditions, and you should leave them alone to the point that they're working, and only bring in government force when it's necessary. But in either case, the goal of the long-standing institutions and the government power is thwart the savage nature of man. And conservatism dovetails very well. There's a lot of overlap religiously with Calvinism. This idea that most of the world is not going to be saved, only the elect, right? And I'm remembering from decades and decades ago of studying this, but I believe it's 144,000, or at least some version of Calvinism, that only 144,000 people will eventually be saved, and the other 8 billion of us are all damned. Okay. So that lines up nicely with this conservative view. Which one inspired the other is anyone's guess, but that's the purpose of the government. And this explains why a conservative is always reluctant to go against the police. Now, I know we've had a lot of instances in the past several years where the police was trying to arrest a violent criminal, and the storyline was completely false about the abuse of force or power. But there's plenty of them. You're going to be able to find plenty of times where the cops do abuse their power. I think it's a small percentage. There's something like 600,000 of them on the street every day, and a couple 100,000 might be federal agents who aren't real cops. But let's just say it's 400,000 out there every day. I don't know. If they make one interaction a day, that's a 500,000 a day. And we get once in a while, we get one of these very egregious abuses by the cops. So I don't know. With all the stuff that people want them to regulate, it's surprising to me we don't get a lot more abuses. So anyway, but they'll never go against the cops. Why? Because the thin blue line idea, that's a conservative idea. They're all there is between us and cars turned over and burning, rioting in the streets, what we saw after George Floyd, like all the time, right? So that's their view of the world, and that's their view on foreign policy. Okay. So the state of nature, which exists between nations to the extent that the UN's not really a government, doesn't have any teeth. We ignore it whenever we want to. Why am I saying that? Put up the Weemus meme with the mouse in your pocket, but the United States government ignores it all the time when it wants to. So different countries exist in a state of nature. So conservatives would tend to believe they have to be conquered. Every nation is a de facto immediate danger unless they're brought under the subjection of the most powerful country. That's why I've always said the neoconservatives are real conservatives. They may be fleeing to the Democrat Party now, but that instinct that we have to dominate the world, what they wrote in the 90s, is definitely a conservative instinct in that it is an attempt to solve the problem that a conservative thinks exists in the state of nature, which is this de facto state of war until some power changes that. So when it comes to economics, this is why I wrote in my book, the natural economic system for conservatives is mercantilism, the tariffs, the national industrial policy. They want private property. They want a market economy to some extent, but they consider international trade part of the war. And Trump even campaigned like this. We never win anymore. He sees all trade deals as somebody's going to win. It's a zero-sum game, right? Not as something that's mutually beneficial to both parties. So I think that the Trump platform is the true conservative platform. It goes back to Alexander Hamilton. And at the founding of the Republic, you had conservatives and libertarians. We'll get to the libertarians in a second. But what did the Federalists want to do? They wanted to put the British system back in place, right? They wanted the British system. They wanted to conserve what they thought was the great system. They just wanted the Americans to run it. That's all. Where the Jeffersonians wanted something completely different because of the way they saw the world. And what you saw throughout the 19th century was conservatism at war with libertarianism. And I would argue that at the end, conservatism won, especially after Lincoln. And you say the word Lincoln and everyone just thinks about the Civil War and slavery, but you got to understand the rest of Lincoln's platform. Like if there never was a Civil War, what he wanted was the same as Alexander Hamilton. He got it through his mentor and idol, Andrew Clay. So when the Federalists went away, a new party emerged called the Whigs. It's great. American history is just perfect because the Federalists were anti-federal, right? They wanted a national government. They wanted centralized power. They didn't want the states to be independent. And then the anti-federalists, since they had to oppose the Federalists, they called themselves the Anti-Federalists, and they wanted federalism. All right. So then the Whigs come along, and what anyone in when did they come along? 1830, somewhere in that range, the 1830s, they would be thinking about the British Whig Party, which was more like the Jeffersonian Republicans. So this Whig Party would be the opposite. And so they call themselves the Whigs. So like the Federalists, they're kind of the opposite of what they call themselves. And then eventually the Whigs go away and the Republican Party forms. Now, in the meantime, Jefferson's party that called themselves the Republicans have gone away and become part of them became the Democratic Party. So now you have the Democratic Party, and the Republicans come along and call themselves by the same name as Jefferson's party, which is very ironic because they were the opposite, of course, of Jefferson's party. They were the same as the Whigs and the Federalists. They wanted the tariffs. They wanted subsidies to corporations for building roads. By the time with Lincoln, it's subsidizing railroads, infrastructure, all of that. The Jeffersonians didn't want the governments building anything, nothing. They started a waffle after a while too, until they all of a sudden they're building a road, but in principle they didn't. So this is conservatism. So when you see a conservative that spends more money than a Democrat, you say, well, how could you do that? I thought conservatives were for limited government. No, maybe if it serves the purpose of keeping order, of thwarting man's natural savagery, then yeah, but that could be set aside. Property rights. Why are they were so opposed to Social Security, but now they defend it staunchly. Why? Well, it's a long-standing tradition now, and getting rid of it would lead to disorder. Okay? So I remember, and I think I mentioned in my book that Tom Woods wrote, someday they'll defend Obamacare. Well, they did. Trump came out and said that we want to keep the good parts. Well, what good parts? I thought it was the worst thing ever. The whole Tea Party movement was formed in resistance against Obamacare unsuccessfully, and now we want to keep the good parts. Okay? So, and sooner or later, the Republicans are going to come out with some national health care system. Trust me, they will. So I guess what I would say is that both of these philosophies, you have to understand what their ultimate goal is. Okay. And for conservatives, the ultimate goal is to repress man's savage instincts. And they always believe, no matter, and they'll even cling to a bad law. And Hobbes writes about this, and Burke kind of implies it himself. I don't know if I didn't read everything he's ever written, but I draw this from some of the things he said, that it's better to leave well enough alone if we don't have disorder, even if it's a bad law. Okay. Because what's worse is allowing the possibility of people disobeying the law or otherwise rebelling against the government. So this drives conservative thinking. You'll hear it once I've told you, if I've said it well enough, you'll hear it everywhere. Okay. And they'll say that rights don't come from the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, but all their conclusions imply that they do. Okay. So watch out for that. And I guess I'll say one other, this is the big thing with like homosexuality, the trans thing. Now I know these things have been weaponized by the far left communists following Marcuse's plan, which I've talked about on this podcast. But even back when there were laws that you just against homosexual activity, where you could be thrown in jail, two guys or gals having sex, that there is the religious aspect to this, but more fundamental is that any aberrant behavior and any libertine behavior, too much partying, anything that's disorderly threatens society. That's where that instinct comes from. That's what they're worried about. So I think it's, to some extent, people say, oh, they're bigoted, they're racist, they're this, they're that, the other thing. And I don't think that's it. I think there's a genuine fear there that anything that disturbs the status quo, especially longstanding institutions like marriage, is a threat to peace, to order. I said in my book, in the movie Gone with the Wind, it's great because they have to condense time down. It's a movie, so you got to get things done fast. So when Atlanta is burning, and Rhett Butler helps Melanie and Scarlett and the nurse, I can't remember her name, and is the baby born? I think the baby's born to get out of Atlanta. They're in a wagon and they show them leaving and the troops are marching out of town. And one of the women, maybe it's Scarlett, says, man, good riddance to him or something. And Rhett Butler says, I wouldn't be in such a hurry to see them go because with them goes all semblance of law and order. And it's like they march out of town, and while they're still in sight, like the looting starts, everything just goes nuts. So that's the conservative view of the world. I'm not saying it's completely wrong, but to them, there's no property in the state of nature. Property is only possible with government. People will not keep contracts in the state of nature. Well, that needs to be enforced by the government, or nobody will keep them. This is the way they think. Now, of course, archaeology has proved that's wrong, that without governments, people traded. I think Walter Block was on our guest, and he was saying they found caves with 10,000 spears in them that date back to the hunter-gatherer periods when they were trading. So in any case, that's the conservative view of the world. So when it seems like they're being inconsistent, ask yourself this, is what they're doing based on what I've said here today, something that is consistent with their ultimate goal for government, which is to thwart man's savage nature. And I think that's all the Trump administration, the MAGA movement absolutely exudes it out of every pore, right? Okay, so let's get to the libertarians. Save the best for last. So the libertarians have a completely different view. And this is why I say you can't really be a right libertarian or a left libertarian. You can like the idea of being a libertarian and even believe in the principles. But if you're clinging to some of the conservative or liberal values, then you're being inconsistent. Okay. You're just not applying the libertarian principle correctly. So what is the libertarian principle? How do they see the world? And as you probably guessed from many other podcasts, if you want to understand this, then you just got to read John Locke. In fact, I think you can just read his second treatise. Forget all the letters of toleration and all that, and the first treatise for that matter. To understand the libertarian outlook, read the second treatise. All the pillars are there. Because I'll say shortly so that somebody doesn't think I'm trying to hide something or anything, but the first treatise, the purpose of the first treatise was to refute work called Patriarcha, which was by a gentleman named Robert Filmer, if I'm not messing up his first name. And it basically argued for an absolute monarch. And it used like the Bible and starting from Adam, here's how we know we have to have an absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings. So the first treatise takes apart that argument. Okay. So having taken apart that argument, the second treatise says that, well, what is the purpose of government? What is man's natural state? And what are we trying to solve about the state of nature? So that's why I can say you can just read the second one and just he starts from scratch, man in the state of nature. And the first thing he says is a state of liberty, right? But Locke does not consider man either the angel that Rousseau considers him, corrupted only when he starts to acquire property, nor is he this complete savage that will always make war upon his brother, will never keep a contract. He actually gives an example of why that's not true. But rather, he says that in the state of nature, there is a law of nature. And here's where conservatives and libertarians will often talk across purposes. Locke does not say that this law of nature will always be respected. He says he doesn't say the words moral principle, but he's describing a moral principle, what should be, not necessarily what is. But Locke's view of the state of nature is that man's born in the state of perfect liberty, but this law of nature restrains him. And the law of nature is reason. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, but reason teaches everyone who will but consult it that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So there's this, that's the limit of man's liberty in the state of nature. Okay? That's what should be. And he also says, and also a state of equality. But the state of equality he describes is not material equality. It's, and I think I actually did a Tom Woods show on this very subject, that what equality meant to Locke was that no person is born with a natural right to rule over anyone else. And that's it. That's the length and breadth of how we're equal. In all other ways, we're not equal. Okay? But that's an important one, because if nobody has any natural right to rule over anybody else, then how could we ever have a government? All right? And his answer is, well, the individual has to consent to it. They have to consent to the government. Now, there's all kinds of problems with this. It is the basis for libertarianism. It's certainly better than the answer provided by conservatives or liberals, in my estimation, the pure democracy or the absolute monarchy or the absolutism of long-standing tradition, whether they're just or not. But before we get to what the government looks like for Locke, what's the purpose of the government? Well, he says that in the state of nature, man naturally acquires property. And for Locke, this is a good thing, essential to survival. And I think he's right about that. And he has his theory of, first of all, he says, every man owns himself. That's indisputable. So that's an a priori thing. And the only other two possibilities are that someone else owns you, okay? Even if there's no government around or no laws or anything, that some people own other people in the state of nature. And there's no basis for that based on what's their claim. We're all promiscuously born to all the same circumstances, as Locke says, something to that effect. So the third possibility is that we're like an unowned good, like a tree growing in a forest on land that nobody owns. And the problem with that is that anyone's got a right to come along and cut you down or take ownership of you. And where is their claim, right? So I think you can arrive at self-ownership a priori. It's self-evident, as the Declaration says. That word evident comes up a lot in Locke. So that's where they got that. Because the people who wrote and approved the Declaration of Independence were all channeling Locke at the time. There were dissenters. They were the majority. So because you have self-ownership and that's where your liberty comes from, because you're in control of where you go, what you do, what you say. And again, the limit of your liberty is that you do not harm somebody else in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. Shorten that to, you do not infringe the property of somebody else, and that you can acquire property out of nature by applying your labor to it. So if you picture a forest, that same forest with a tree on unowned land, can't be somebody else's land because that changes things. But you go into the forest and you pick some apples off the tree. Well, and you bring them back in a basket and they're sitting on your table. Those are your property. Why? Because you applied some of your labor. You actually traded some finite part of your life, or some part of your finite life, whatever. You've only got so many minutes and hours in your life, and you've traded some of them. You've applied that labor to those resources, and you brought them back to your cabin or wherever. So they're yours. Why aren't they somebody else's? Because nobody else's labor was applied to those, was traded for those. Okay? And he answers the question, well, don't you need someone's permission? Well, no, not if the land isn't owned. And he says there are some people, like Rousseau, who says that you can't take resources out of nature without the permission of the whole community. Of course, there is no community in the state of nature. There might be a community, there's no government. So, what Locke says is man had starved had such a permission been required, despite the bounty God had put in front of him, something to that effect. So, and it's not practical that no one can ever use an unowned natural resource unless they get the permission of everybody else. Because where does that end? Why is it just the town? Why isn't it the country? Why isn't it the whole world? And even if it is, well, within this distance from the town, no, there is no basis for that. These things are not owned by the other people. They haven't done anything to establish ownership over those apples. Okay? So that's an important part. And another important part of Locke's philosophy is the centrality of property, starting with self-ownership. Because you'll hear a lot of people, including our founders, who did not do us any favors by doing this, saying the words life, liberty, and property. Locke never says that. In fact, he says like the opposite of that. Life, liberty, and our justly acquired possessions are all part of a general concept that he calls property. So when he says the word property, that includes life, that includes liberty, and that includes your money, land, and stuff. Okay? And that makes it real easy for him to then go on to say the great and chief end why people form commonwealths and put themselves under the power of government is preservation of their property, which in the state of nature is very uncertain. And that's the libertarian outlook. Okay, I'll get to the anarcho-capitalists in a minute, of which I am one, by the way, at least theoretically. I'm not expecting it anytime soon. But libertarians don't see the state of nature, don't see man, first of all, as complete savage or a complete angel. I think libertarians see man in the most realistic way. He's capable of great good. He will make agreements and keep them with people. And he'll also break them under some circumstances. Maybe not everybody, but enough to make too much trouble not to do something about it, right? Most of the people will do the right thing most of the time. Some of the people will do the wrong thing all of the time. Most of the people under enough duress would probably do the wrong thing. So libertarians say, and Locke says, what do we want to do with the government? We want to preserve property, something that already exists in the state of nature, life, liberty, and justly acquired possessions. And we want to, he's the only one that wants to bring the state of nature into society. All those things that are good about the state of nature come in, and we only want to thwart infringements of property. That's the only thing the government's supposed to do. And the government's just powers are limited to this. He goes so far as to say in one of his passages that he makes a case, okay, so let me get to what I said before about consent. So he's like, oh, how is this consent obtained? And he's right on the cusp of saying you got to have an anarcho-capitalist system. And so later is Sam Adams, by the way. But he kind of throws up his hands and says, well, you're never going to get unanimity, so you just have to go with the majority's will. And then he makes a pitch for basically a constitutional monarchy where there's a separation of powers between the executive king, the prince, and the legislature made up of legislators. Say that 5 times fast. So, and the legislators make the laws and the executive executes the laws. So that comes out of him. But he goes so far as to say that the legislature can have, even though the majority has elected it, they can have no more power than any one individual had in the state of nature. So that's quite striking. Now, he says when you enter society, you don't give up any of your natural rights. In fact, you go into society so that they're better protected. But what you give up is the right to judge. your own case. You can't do that. So you go into society and you defer to the government to judge when there's a dispute, and you defer to the government to administer the remedy. And the remedy in a dispute, a crime or a tort in society, the remedy is to make you whole again. Your property has been infringed, whether that's your life, your liberty, or your stuff, your money. And so the purpose is to make you whole again. Now, if you kill somebody, you can't make them whole again. And during this time, of course, I'm sure Locke would go along with hanging people if they commit murder. But that's the outlook. That's the libertarian view, okay? And it's completely different from the conservative view. And that's why they butt heads so much. That's why the Jeffersonians and the Federalists hated each other, because the Federalists were conservative and the Jeffersonians were libertarian. And they thought there was a completely different purpose for the government, and that translated into their policies. Why the Federalists wanted a central bank and the Jeffersonians did not. That's why the Federalists wanted high protective tariffs and the Jeffersonians did not. That's why the Federalists wanted the government building roads and canals and all sorts of things with taxpayer money, and the Jeffersonians did not. In fact, the federal government building roads was still an issue when Buchanan was president. And then when Lincoln got in there and the Republicans, that all went away. And even in my book, I quote, I think it's Seymour Dunbar, he's a historian, among other things, about transportation in America. And he says right in one of his footnotes, before the Civil War, roads were considered a private thing. That's private companies do that. And it was only after the Civil War that it started to become something that people thought of as the government doing. Why? Because the Republican Party of Lincoln was the same as the Whigs and the Federalists. That was their platform. I think that was Lincoln's main platform. Slavery, which he did oppose, was just something that got him that extra amount of votes they needed to get elected, because they used to lose all the time and their parties would go away. So you got the anti-slavery part of the Republican Party, the radical Republicans, and then you got the rest of them are all former Whigs. And their main thing is, we want to subsidize the railroads. We want a central bank. We want to build high protective tariffs. So, and we got all that after the Republicans were in power for the last third of the century. So, of course, that's Trump. I'm telling you, Trump is Lincoln. He's Andrew Clay. He's Alexander Hamilton. I think I have an article called Trump Isn't Hitler, He's Hamilton, very back from when he was first running. He is. And that's why Teddy Roosevelt, there's another one of the worst presidents in U.S. history by our libertarian standards. He's a hero to conservatives. He was in there. He's tough. He told those corporations what to do. The trust buster, right? So that's a farce, of course. His administration was wholly owned by JP Morgan. So the only trusts they busted were Rockefeller trusts. Okay. And he even said there was good trusts. And which ones are those? Well, they're the Morgan trusts. He didn't come right out and say that, but that was the policy. But I digress. So that's the three ways. So the libertarians are saying, look at the purpose of the government is to protect property, is to defend property rights. And those include our lives, our liberties, our justly acquired possessions, our money, our stuff, our ability to make voluntary trades with people without any regulation or interference from the government. This is the Jeffersonian position. I'm not saying that those people were perfect on this, but that's what they were going for. Wars are only defensive, right? Well, what about the anarcho-capitalists who don't think there should be a government? Yeah, but they think there should be law and order. And what they would replace the government with, the competing firms to provide security, would be doing the same thing. See, the goal would be the same. The form would be different. Like the form between Hobbes and Burke is different, but the goal, the purpose is the same for those two, to thwart man's natural savage instincts. For libertarians, whether you have this night watchman limited government envisioned by Jefferson and Sam Adams and John Locke, or whether you have private firms providing the same things, the goal is the same, which is preservation of our property, which the modern government, it's like a joke, right? So you've seen what I've done on federal spending. I'm going to do state spending, and I've got a little hint for you. State spending's even worse than federal spending on this, about like what percentage is just taking money from one person and giving it to another. Maybe I'll do that one next. But this one's a little bit of a long podcast. Hopefully I explain the differences between these ways of seeing the world and how they really are incompatible. Now, I will say libertarians and conservatives make nice with each other because they both do support private property. Okay, and that's the difference from the liberals. And to that, the conservatives don't think it's a natural right or an inalienable right, and they're willing to violate property rights all over the place, but not to the extent the liberals are. And even in the American Revolution, it was an alliance between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives like Hamilton, like Washington, like John Adams, he was kind of inconsistent with a foot in both camps in some cases, but mainly a conservative. And libertarians like Sam Adams, like Jefferson, like George Mason, who called himself a man of 1688, which refers to the Glorious Revolution and inspired by John Locke. But as soon as the revolution was won and the British were no longer a military threat, they started fighting each other savagely, right? Because the two philosophies ultimately are not compatible. And it doesn't mean that liberals and conservatives can't be nice people, by the way. I'm saying the political philosophies, the outlook on what are we trying to do with government or with what replaces government are not compatible. Because if it's thwarting man's savage instincts, you're going to need to violate his property rights sometimes. And that's just got to break some eggs. And if it's equality, of course, that's the definition. You're violating property rights. That's the purpose. That's why you have a government. So look out for that way of how people define themselves. How do I say this? Look out for that ultimate perspective coming from liberals, conservatives, and libertarians. And to me, that explains everything. And I think you'll see those perspectives just jumping out at you from conservatives and from Democrats and Republicans as liberals and conservatives, and then the libertarians. And Thomas Massie is a libertarian. He's in the Republican Party. He'll call himself a conservative like Ron Paul used to when he asked to get votes, but he's not. He's a rhino. So is Ron Paul. And I can't think of a bigger compliment for either one of these great men. And so was I in the last election. I didn't register with the party, but I voted for the goofball. And I'm still not sorry I did it, although he's doing all kinds of terrible things. I'm hoping some good comes out of it. Give me your comments. I'd really like to hear from you on this. I gave this talk, gosh, it was like 15 years ago, to the Republican Liberty Caucus when I lived in Florida. And I can't remember if I drove to Jacksonville to do this, but I had people coming up to me and saying, it was an eye-opener for them. So hopefully it was an eye-opener for some of you. Think it over, chew on it, give me your comments. You don't have to agree with me. Leave your comments on the show notes page, and I'll see you next time.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.